The Lord of the Rings of Power is Amazon's latest attempt at adapting a beloved work of literature for their streaming service. They've done some outstanding work with shows like The Expanse and The Terminal List, and they've done some terrible work with shows like The Wheel of Time. But ever since the first trailer released for The Rings of Power, this show has been in serious trouble with Tolkien fans. But what exactly is it that's making people so angry at the show? Well, I've got some passionate and opinionated ideas on the matter, so let's get into it. I'll start with a direct quote from the director of the 3 Lord of the Rings movies, Peter Jackson. Quote, "We made a promise to ourselves at the beginning of the process that we weren't going to put any of our own politics, our own messages, or our own themes into these movies. In a way, we were trying to make these films for him, not for ourselves." End quote. The him that Jackson is referring to is the great linguist and author of the Lord of the Rings books, J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, in contrast, here's a quote from the Rings of Power showrunner, Patrick McKay. "It's the story of the creation of all of those powers, where they came from, and what they did to each of those races. Can we come up with the novel Tolkien never wrote, and do it as the mega event series that could only happen now?" End quote. So based on this quote, there is a glaring problem with the way Patrick McKay treats the source material, namely the line, "Can we come up with the novel Tolkien never wrote?" And my response is an emphatic no, you can't. Where Peter Jackson's vision of The Lord of the Rings was selfless in the sense that he wanted to make the movies to honor Tolkien's work, McKay's vision is completely self-centered. McKay has no respect for the genius of Tolkien because he actually thinks his writers can do it better than the creator himself. Peter Jackson had the humility to accept that the source material was sufficient. It didn't need to be altered in any big way to connect with audiences. There were definitely changes made for the sake of cinematic drama, but the heart of the story remained intact. Now, Amazon only has the rights to the appendices to The Return of the King, which establish some chronology of the Second and Third Ages, contains family trees, and charts of Elvish scripts. They bought these rights knowing that it didn't contain an established story that they could adapt, which meant that they could just make one up and say it's part of Lord of the Rings. Patrick and his team couldn't care less about Tolkien's work, which he spent his whole life crafting. They've instead created generic fantasy, overflowing with modern Western sensibilities, which neither looks nor feels like Middle-earth. And it didn't take fans long to recognize something wasn't quite right with the established characters in this show. Galadriel was being portrayed as some kind of warrior queen who goes into battle alongside male elves, which is absurd and completely different from how she is described in the books. Elrond was being portrayed as an ambitious politician, which is just about the lamest thing I've ever heard. That's what I've been missing in my life. Elrond negotiating elvish trade disputes. Did George Lucas write this? What's so irritating about this is Tolkien described both these characters in great detail. All you have to do is read it. There's no excuse for completely changing their personalities. Galadriel is not a warrior. She was called the mightiest and fairest of all elves, but might isn't relegated to physical power. She has the ability to peer into the minds of others and judge them fairly, as shown in the Fellowship of the Ring. She doesn't need a sword in order to be strong. Elrond is the real warrior. He's the one who fought during the last alliance of men and elves and witnessed the One Ring cut from Sauron's finger. The writers are trampling all over Tolkien's legacy. The problem is that they don't care. They didn't make this for fans or for Tolkien. They made it for themselves. Then we have the issue of the portrayal of the different races in Middle-earth, but let me preface with this. Tolkien wrote The Lord of the Rings to be a mythology for England, so naturally the look of the characters would reflect that. Just like in Greek mythology, the characters are portrayed as looking distinctly Greek, or in African mythology, the characters look African. So when I see elves and dwarves being portrayed as having dark skin, I can't help but feel like the writers are either completely ignorant to Tolkien's books, or being intentionally disrespectful to them. Modern writers seem to have some issue with the cast of characters being all white. We saw this with Robert Eggers' The Northman, which was criticized for its lack of diversity, even though it's set in 9th century Europe. There's nothing wrong with a diverse cast, but in this case it's not appropriate to the story. That's not racist or offensive. What's offensive is when people feel the need to add tokenized characters into stories for no other reason than some dehumanizing diversity checkbox. There's a certain sense of hubris I get from the writers and producers of this show that unfortunately seems to be commonplace in modern entertainment when dealing with beloved IPs. We saw it with The Last Jedi when understandably disappointed fans were blasted as being trolls, or with Ghostbusters 2016 when anyone who criticized the film was labeled sexist. Maybe it'll take a disaster like The Rings of Power for these people to learn their lesson. There's even been reports that the show might contain nudity in it. Now this is the nail in the coffin. Tolkien was a deeply religious man, and never, not once, did he write anything containing nudity. I hope that this is just a rumor, because although I will absolutely not be watching this show, the mere thought of nudity in a Lord of the Rings show is appalling. It's the ultimate slap in the face of Tolkien's beliefs. His work isn't depraved trash like Game of Thrones. There's a hopeful innocence to the Lord of the Rings that should be maintained in any adaptation. The fact that nudity being in this show is even a consideration shows you how little the writers care about the source material and its creator. Tolkien set out to create a mythology for England, and he accomplished that. What's more, he crafted a story that captivated not just England, but the entire world. The Lord of the Rings is one of the most cherished and beloved book series of all time, and in my opinion is the single greatest work of fantasy ever created. So it goes without saying that these stories hold a special place in millions of people's hearts. There are people from all parts of the world who can relate to the Lord of the Rings because of the deep archetypal themes of the triumph of good over evil, the struggle to resist corrupting power, the beauty and joy of friendships like that of Frodo and Sam. Tolkien is for everyone. It doesn't need to be changed. It doesn't need to be updated for modern audiences. That's why fans are so angry at this show. But I think that Amazon is in for a rude awakening. The fans have spoken. The Rings of Power does not respect Tolkien, and no amount of money can fix that.